My name is Julia Ferraioli, and I am a developer advocate with Google Cloud Platform. And today, I'm really excited to be able to introduce Dan Shapiro, founder and CEO of Glowforge, amongst a number of other amazing criteria, which I'm sure we will dive into as well. Oh, and we've got like the nice screen there. So in addition to being the CEO of Glowforge, Dan is also the creator of Robot Turtles. Who here has heard of the board game Robot Turtles? We've got a few. I highly recommend checking it out. It's an amazing board game that broke Kickstarter records, which is fantastic.
Back when the records were lower. A couple of years ago.
You've also broken some recent, more recent records than that with Glowforge breaking crowdfunding history in 30 days?
Yeah, I think we had the highest 30-day total for anything Kickstarter, Indiegogo, et cetera.
Right, yes. Okay, so I want to show you a brief video about Glowforge. This is their introduction, so you can see what Glowforge is capable of and how you can interact with it.
Start with the design that you download or create. Choose from dozens of materials, even recycled cardboard. The laser cuts and engraves your design. It's precise to the width of a human hair, so it's easy to assemble remarkable things. Use your Mac, PC, or tablet to drag your design into place. Print from organic material like wood, leather, paper, cloth, even chocolate. Sometimes you don't want to design from scratch. Print from the Glowforge catalog. You can resize and personalize to make it perfect for you. Your design can be as simple as a photo. Your favorite apps like Photoshop and Illustrator can print directly to create physical objects. Glowforge cuts holes with such precision that you can lace up leather like a shoe. If you draw material with an ordinary pen, dual cameras create a 3D image of your material and your drawing. Glowforge will engrave and cut directly over the ink. Then it's as easy to make a dozen copies as it is to make just one. Glowforge has autofocus that can follow curved surfaces like this MacBook. Cameras automatically identify what you put inside, so it's safe to personalize your laptop with designs from the catalog or your own photos and text. You can make a daily essential, a unique gift, a thriving business, or you can just make lunch. You don't have to be a clothing designer, an artist, or a pastry chef. You can build a mansion without being an architect. Glowforge is a tool that's easy enough and safe enough for anyone to use. Unlike this drone, with rubber band Gatling guns. We've been working hard to make something amazing for you. I'm Dan Shapiro, and this is Glowforge. Our team has built everything from cell phones to search engines, but this is something different. I have one in my home. I want you to have one too.
That's an amazing video, and I want some printed chocolate, because that seems, A, like a really hard problem to solve.
It actually took us a week of profiling different chocolates to figure out exactly the right blend of chocolates to make that work and the right laser settings and everything else. So
really?
That was a crazy project.
Wow. Imagine that it might try to melt on you.
Yeah, the right
Maybe?
trade-off between you want to vaporize it but not melt it, and so you get the cut line without a big chocolate puddle. It was a lot of fun.
And tasty, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it was actually really nasty because when we were done, we got tired of tempering chocolate, so we went for the candy chocolate that's like got all, it's like low chocolate content and it's always shiny and you don't have to go through the tempering process, but it's easier to work with.
Easier to experiment on, at least.
Movie magic, yes.
Movie magic, yes. Okay. Okay, so let's see if we can get the slides back. Okay, so this is actually one of the images from Glowforge's homepage.
Yeah, our firmware engineer, Matt, actually made this for his girlfriend. I think they met at Space Needle or had their first date there. And so he did this out of cherry wood. It's about a 1/4 inch thick, just sort of to get a sense for scale. It doesn't actually use any glue. The whole thing snaps together. And it was so awesome. I asked him to print a couple extras so we could use them as showcase pieces. But it was just something he'd done puttering around in. I think he actually designed it entirely in 2D and just did the 3D in his head rather than doing it in CAD. But it was kind of a neat piece.
And it's interesting because I know from my limited experience watching old episodes of This Old House, having the ability to make tight connections without, different materials to glue it together or to secure it together produces a much more kind of solid piece that's less prone to breakages as well.
Yeah, one of the
That's my
early design questions was how do we take the consistent behavior of the laser, which is very esoteric and has lots of edge cases, but is pretty much operates the same way every time, and use that to produce predictable prints every time. And that was ultimately the sort of thought process that led us to, hey, we want to apply really large-scale computing resources to the problem. We don't want a little firmware that's taking G code, which is kind of the low-level language invented in the 50s or 60s for running milling machines, and running that. We actually want to have a very high level of abstraction of the material, of the laser, of the manufacturing process, so we can produce really replicable results. And we didn't think we could do that effectively, cost effectively running on the machine, which ultimately led to the whole, let's put all the brains in the cloud and make the machine as simple and straightforward as possible.
So can you describe a little bit about what happens in the software besides the hardware itself? Like, what else is there? There's the Glowforge. There's the ability to transfer images to the Glowforge. What else happens in the cloud?
So the way the architecture works is that the user interface is through a browser. It's a browser-based application, and you can use your iPad, you can use your computer. There's no reason you can't use a phone, although we haven't phone optimized the UI yet. And so it starts out, actually, when you first plug in the machine, you're going to connect to it locally over a Wi-Fi access point that it broadcasts and configure it, because it's got one button and no screen. So you're going to connect up to, like a Nest thermostat or a drop cam, but like no screen. So you connect up to it, you get it on your home or office Wi-Fi. That point, you can log in from a browser and you can see the machine, you can pair it with your account. And from then on, that's how you're interacting with it. So I'll give you a really straightforward example, something we do all the time, which is you might go into Adobe Illustrator or any other design software, create software. With Illustrator, there's a plugin. Otherwise, you can use a PDF, and you're going to take the output of that and push it to our cloud service. Pulls up a web page, and then you're going to see a real live preview of the actual bed of the machine. Put a piece of material in there. Could be leather, could be wood, could be seaweed or chocolate. Put something in there, and it'll have its own unique characters and imperfections, and you can actually drag around your design to figure out where it's going to go. And this is all being done locally in the browser. So the browser app is manipulating basically an SVG in real time, superimposed on top of the bitmap that's pulled over from the device. Then you say, okay, go, and it sends that up to the server. The server actually goes and does a whole bunch of work manipulating the SVG into its final form, and then doing things like figuring out what's the motion plan, where does the head of the laser need to go at what time, what speeds. It knows the acceleration parameters of the laser, so it knows how fast it can go, how fast it can accelerate, decelerate, when to turn it on, when to turn it off. And it winds up with the simplest possible format, which is basically a pulse file, ones and zeros, compresses them, and then sends that down to the machine. And the Glowforge's job is just to decompress that and feed it out in real time to the motors and to the lasers and to the fans and everything else, all the onboard systems. But the goal is to make the firmware on the machine incredibly simple. So it does run Linux. It's a fairly standard stripped down distro, but we want to update the firmware as infrequently as possible, because every time you update the firmware on a machine, there's risk of breaking and risk of everything else. So we want to be able to innovate in the motion plan and the UI and the design and all that, and the speed of software up in the cloud rather than having to do it in the firmware. So on the back end, we're running Google Compute Cloud. We're using Docker containers for all the various components, not using Kubernetes yet, although one of our investors, Joe Beta, one of the creators of Kubernetes, is helping us get that up to speed before we ship for maintaining containers. And let's see, everything's in, all the designs are in Google Cloud Storage. I'm trying to think if there's anything else particularly interesting about that. So yeah, every machine is basically connected up to the cloud. Every user's connecting up through a client, and our goal is always to do as much on the server as we can. And the stuff that's down on the machine is basically either the offline setup, the updater for the firmware, and the hard real-time stuff, and that's it.
So putting the brains of the operation into the cloud allows you to ship the product, but continually offer improvements and new features and flexibility.
Yeah, I've said half seriously, the only thing we have to get right in the firmware is the updater. Like if we can ship with a functioning firmware updater, then all other problems are solvable. But by pulling as much of that as possible into the cloud, it lets us do stuff and cool stuff. Like, for example, let's say we discover a common problem with all the existing lasers that we figured out how to solve is if you're drawing a square, you have to slow down for the corners because you've got physics to deal with. You have to decelerate and then start up again. And you wind up having a little hole in the corner where the laser does, a nice lighting, if you're just trying to engrave, just does a nice light engraving, but then it slows down, stops. And so you wind up with a hole. So let's say that we have a change that says, okay, we're going to decrease the power as you approach the corner, and we want to push that out. There's a couple of interesting problems with doing that typically. One is, when do you push that? How do you get that update out? There are people who are in the middle of printing. You want to test that with folks. So given this architecture, we can say, okay, first we're pushing it out to people who've signed up for beta. Then we're going to push it out to 1%. And we're going to wait a couple days and see if we get any complaints. Then we're going to push it out to 50%. Then we're going to do A/B testing and see, how user satisfaction results. Then we're going to push it out to everybody who is not in the middle of an active print, right? Because in any given time, there's some people who are actually using the thing. And then finally, we'll push it out to everybody, but we'll let you keep the old motion planning algorithm if you like its results and don't want to change it. We can leave that around indefinitely and have it run side by side with the new one. And so that, that's a level of flexibility that's just never before possible in this sort of machinery where, you're pushing a PC client app, because most lasers run like, Windows XP, Windows 7 if you're lucky, like local client apps, or it's just in the firmware of the machine and you're hoping people push your firmware update.
So let's go back a little bit. What made you realize that, hey, lasers are a good place for some innovation? What drew you to lasers in the first place?
So it was this weird line starting in college when I built laser shows and put myself through college doing laser shows at parties and this weird little DJ business at Harvey Mudd where I went to school. But set all that aside for a long time and did a bunch of software startups, worked at Google, worked at Microsoft. And then took a leave of absence when I was at Google and wound up creating this board game. And a friend of mine said, boy, my son loves the turtles. And he carried the turtle in his pocket for 3 days before it got so grimy and because it's cardboard, right? And it's a total disaster. He's like, you should sell a super premium version of the game where you actually have dimensional turtles that my kid can shove in his pocket. And I was like, all right. Turtles you can shove in your pocket. That sounds like a fun thing. So I always wanted to want a 3D printer, but I could never figure out what I wanted one for. And so I was like, as soon as I figure out one thing I'm going to do with a 3D printer, I'm going to go to the makerspace and do it. And if I can figure out 3 things, I'm going to buy a 3D printer. So I had my first ever thing to do with a 3D printer. So I went to the local makerspace and I got this stringy blob of plastic and I paid $20 for it. I was like, this stinks. And so I looked at SLA and it's, different technologies for 3D printing and they were brittle and it was all really frustrating. So I went back to the same friend who actually works at a shop that does custom fabrication for Boeing. And I said, tell me every machine you have in the shop. What can I make these damn turtles out of? So we went through the whole thing, and at some point he mentioned lasers. I said, in the game, the turtles have lasers on their backs. It'd be cool if I had like a special laser edition. And also it would be really awesome to have an excuse to go buy a laser. So one thing led to another, and I've got this $11,000 industrial carbon dioxide cutting laser installed in my garage. I should mention I have a very patient wife. And it was like this core of utter magic surrounded by layers and layers of horribleness. I mean, to give you but one example, after spending days getting it aligned and configured and everything else, I'm on the phone because I'm just trying to cut a line, the simplest thing possible, right? And it's crashing every single time I send the laser. And so I talk to the importers, I try to talk to the team that manufactures it. It turns out there's, the software actually comes from Boston, and so I talk to the team in Boston and I get escalated to the engineer who wrote the code, and he says, wait, what are you trying to draw? And I'm like, a horizontal line. He's like, so you mean like y equals 0? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, oh, I'm dividing by the height. Sorry about that. Nobody had ever tried to draw a line before on laser. So this stuff was just really, it was designed for sort of small-scale factory production where people would spend a long time creating design, getting everything to work, and then you just crank out one after another. But once you did, the products were beautiful. They're actually made out of materials that you want and that you could use, and it was fast, and once you had it working, iteration was really easy. So it felt like there was this beautiful core surrounded by all this terribleness. So that's when I started talking to some friends who are entrepreneurs, and one who had a design background, one who had a hardware background, and said, could we pair up this core of lasers that can cut and engrave things with modern sensor technology out of, I said, let's imagine everything in a 2-year-old iPhone is free. Every part on a 2-year-old iPhone is free. So we get all the microphones and accelerometers and cameras we want for approximately 0 cost. What could we take out of the bill of materials of a traditional laser? How could we make it even better? And that's when we started to come up with all sorts of crazy things. Like, as an example, there's an assembly in every laser on the market. And it deals with how you align your drawing relative to your material. Because the laser is very precise relative to itself, but you're putting it on like a piece of leather or a piece of cardboard, which is just somewhere sitting on the bed. And the traditional way to do that is with a little tiny laser pointer that is a secondary laser with this complex optical system to have it go exactly where the real laser is going to go. And then you tell the laser to draw an outline of what it's going to do. And it's difficult. It adds hundreds of dollars worth of cost. And it means you actually have an exposed laser beam that the user could reflect into their eyeballs, which means that it's less safe than if it was all interlocked and put away. In technical terms, it's a class 3 device instead of a class 1 device like your DVD player. And we said, well, what if we just got rid of all that and had a camera? And you just, drag the thing to where you want it to go, and then you could see it. And that costs us less, it's easier to use, and so on and so forth. So that notion of like, hey, if we brought this into today and moved all the brains off board, put low-cost sensors on instead of high-cost optics and mechanical units, what could we do? That was the birth of where it all started.
So did the people who were working on lasers up to that point just not consider these options? Were they really building it more for industrial use than bringing it to the personal use?
Yeah, I mean, there's wonderful devices out there. Companies like Universal and Epilogue make these tanks. They're made out of solid metal. The lasers themselves are solid laser tubes. They are designed to last for decades, and they do last for decades. Like if you go onto eBay, you will not see a used one of these for less than $15,000 because it doesn't matter if they're used, they're just kind of the same. And every 6 years you pay $5 to $7 grand to recharge the tube, and you're off again. You've got a service person who comes in and oils everything.
Right.
And that's been the market up till now. And so to go in there and say, hey, what if the market for this was people who buy amazing sewing machines? What if the market for this was the people who are buying vinyl cutters and scrapbooking? What if the market for this is people who are buying MakerBots for their shop or for their school or for their maker space? What if that was the market instead of people who are cutting and engraving things for their business? P.S. also them too.
Right.
But at the smaller scale and at the lower end, because it's a lower power laser on the scale, and that means it's not as fast as a 100-watt or 200-watt laser that you get from some of the larger companies. How big would that market be? And it's been really gratifying to see that, yeah, this is something people do get excited about and do want for themselves.
And in fact, I believe you crossed, was it
Yeah, it was 27.9 million after 30 days.
In pre-orders.
That was a bit of a surprise to us. We sat down, and when we were doing our planning, we're like, okay, time to place bets. And so I sat down with my exec team and our board member, Brad Feld from Foundry Group. And so we all sort of took bets, and then we said, okay, and what's the top end? And the most funded 3D printer to date had raised 3.5 million in a 30-day period. And so we decided like 5 million was our, like, oh my gosh, maybe we could do it. And it's just been incredible. Way beyond anything we'd expected, and it really puts a lot on us in a very positive way, but also something we think about seriously when we come in every day. If you go to community.glowforge.com, only people who've ordered can post there. Anybody can read it, and there's this really humbling conversation where somebody says, "This is the car I sold to buy my Glowforge." And somebody said, "Oh yeah, me too, this is the car I sold to buy Glowforge." And somebody else said, "I took out a loan against my 401k. And somebody else said, "I've already let my boss know that I'm going to give notice when I get this so I can go and start my company." And when we come into work every day, that's what we're thinking about, which is that we owe these people something. They paid for it, and we need to deliver it to them. And it needs to be even better than we promised, because they're going to be changing their livelihoods around this. And that's one of the tremendous challenges of creating hardware, is that people can see it before it exists. People can imagine it before it exists. And people will change their lives around what you promise them. And so being able to deliver on those promises is pretty humbling.
That's a huge responsibility. And that must make you take the community aspect of Glowforge incredibly seriously as well. What do you envision for how the community interacts with each other as once Glowforge ships and people start making things?
Yeah, and one of the things that that was important to us from the start was to think about the software side of it every bit as much as the hardware side of it. And it's easy to get really focused on the hardware because we need to ship a large box of laser to a whole lot of people really soon. But in the longer term, we think that the value of this is unlocked by the software that we build, and that is just a tool for building community around it. So beyond the, here's the interface and here's how it works, it's this notion of how do people share designs? How do people monetize their designs? How do we, at the same time, how do we make this a place where creative people can build a business? And how do we embrace and not commodify the design and creativity that comes out of these? Because ultimately we think this is a way that people can go and take their ideas and turn them into businesses, whether it be a board game or a wallet or a piece of artwork, and creating an environment that's warm and welcoming to that, while at the same time respecting people's IP. If you've been to Thingiverse, which is MakerBot's sort of open source place, open location you can download products. There's some premium products that you pay for, but there's a whole lot of the, I call it the scan my elbow phenomenon, which is, hey, look, I just got a Kinect and I 3D scanned my elbow, and here it is, because you can upload anything there. And it's not a great place for designers and for creative people to show their best work. And it's really hard, bordering on impossible, to build a business around it, because it's just kind of a big repository. So figuring out how do we build a community that values that creates and contributes, build a premium experience where people can go and make a living off of selling their digital designs, and at the same time empower people to go and just share freely for those people who want to do so. That's been a real ongoing challenge as we think about building the ecosystem around the hardware that we're creating.
Right, and when I think about when I think about the potential for people sharing their designs, obviously it has a lot of the questions surrounding IP, and I'm seeing the idea of public domain images that people can base ideas off of getting a whole lot more popular, so that they can fork and modify and then use their Glowforge on. So it's been really interesting. It's an interesting journey to have seen kind of take place.
Yeah, we have a discussion thread where I basically said, hey, how do you want this to work? And it was so far from having a singular answer. There were people who said, I want an FTP site where I can put any file and anybody else can get it. And there are people who say, I want a completely locked down experience where everything I put in there is DRM'd and tracked and pay per this and that and everything else, and everywhere in between. And so figuring out the right solution to accommodate everybody is going to be something, we're going to iterate towards that as we after we ship. But I think that's a really important part of any modern piece of hardware, which is the value so often comes from the software that plugs into it rather than just the hardware itself. Figuring out how to create that ecosystem so that it supports rather than undermining what you're trying to build with the product.
Yeah, you're trying to build up the community rather than kind of regulated way.
Exactly.
Yeah, awesome. So I want to switch tracks a little bit and touch on how this was really made possible. You have kind of an interesting history with crowdfunding, and coming from one of the questions on the internet, from Twitter and from the Google form for the longer form questions, was based from a position that you stated in your book Hot Seat, which is the guide to CEO-hood, which is an amazing and humbling book to read. But in there you stated that you were kind of wary of crowdfunding at first. How did you grow to encompass it in such a phenomenally successful way?
So it started out in Kickstarter's early days, and a friend of mine, Alon Lee, he's, for those of you who played the game Exploding Kittens, he's a creator of Exploding Kittens and won a couple of Emmy Awards for TV shows, and he's this amazing creative guy. And he's like, Dan, I got this amazing thing on Kickstarter. It's so great. And I was like, tell me about this Kickstarter thing. And he's like, well, you give them money, and then maybe later they send you something. And I was like, you get equity? No. But they don't have to deliver anything? No, the terms and services are very clear. Terms and conditions are very clear. They don't actually have to send you anything. I'm like, so it's charity? I just did not understand at all what this was about. And he was really excited. I remember the thing he told me about was a fish tank for jellyfish. So it was a unique, lucite, beautiful thing. Since been called the whining jellyfish death trap. Because apparently it's a better meat grinder for jellyfish than it is a habitat for them, and it just kills anything you put in it.
Oh wow! Okay.
So it turned out it did ship close to on time, but was just an utter failure from a product quality standpoint. And he'd backed dozens of Kickstarters, and I was just looking at this going, I don't even understand what this is about. So he'd been working on a TV show that had some relationship to Kickstarter, and I was helping with him. And I had this okay, I have to wrap my head around this. So I went and just pledged $1 to a bunch of Kickstarters, so I'd start getting their updates. And then I was like, oh, this is kind of cool, and I kind of want some. Okay, so I pledged some money to a couple of Kickstarters. And actually, coincidentally, as it happens, this hoodie was a Kickstarter from some people who wanted to start up a clothing studio in Los Angeles and bring back some of the handmade quality. And I will say right now they are shipping, it's called Pistol Lake, they're shipping amazing clothing. This one, which is one of the first ones off their lines, has a few frays and some of the stitching didn't quite work out, but they got it all sorted out. And so it kind of changed the way I think about it. Very cynically, it's a legitimization of vaporware, which has been going on forever. But sort of in a good way, in that you're putting all your cards on the table. You're saying, look, you used to pay for stuff because we lied to you and told you it was ready. No, now we're actually telling you exactly where it's at, exactly what you get. You're going to be paying usually a better price for it than you would otherwise. You're going to get it when it's ready, which we expect is going to be on this date. I think more optimistically, it's this notion of involving your customers in your development process, which from the standpoint of a creator is magical. You get the funds to go deliver the product. You get, but 10 times more than that, you get to find out if people love and care about what you're doing, and you actually get their participation in the creative process. So the Glowforge is going to be a 10x better product for all the feedback that we've gotten from our users over the course. Now it's interesting because hardware, we had to make and lock most of the hardware decisions up front before the crowdfunding campaign. But we can do so much in the software based on what we've heard that at launch our software is going to be far better than it would have been otherwise, and it'll continue to improve with that. So it means you get the dollars that you can go into production. There's two real costs to starting a hardware company. There's all the infrastructure, there's the rent and salaries and everything else, and then there's the actual manufacturing costs. And I'd say that best practices for crowdfunding are that you use the dollars you get from the crowdfunding for manufacturing and production, and if you're paying yourself a salary, if you're paying rent, you get those dollars from somewhere else, from your savings or from investors or something like that. But there's some campaigns that are very upfront as well, and they'll say, I am raising $50,000 so that I can pay myself to spend the next year of my life developing this software, or I'm going to spend some of this on the hardware I'm going to deliver and some of this on rent and R&D or whatever else. At the end of the day, I think any creator who's honest with their backers about where they're at and what they're doing is doing it well. The place where I think we've gotten into trouble is there's a little bit of malice where you see people who are actually trying to fleece their backers and just mislead folks and take the money, saying X is done when it's not done, or having no intention of doing it, or saying they're developing something when really they're just repackaging something somebody else made. But that's dwarfed by just boundless optimism and people who are creating projects without really understanding what they're committing to, without really thinking through the financial repercussions of what they're doing. All that said, if you are creating a product where you have clarity about what you need to do, where you can communicate that, boy, it's hard to argue against talking to your customers first. And it's hard to argue that you should hold off putting it out for sale when in fact there are people out there who are willing to buy it before it's finished. And as long as you're honest and transparent about that as a business, I think that it's all good for all parties involved.
Absolutely, and it, as you said, it gets customers or potential customers involved earlier, and I think it also helps people conquer that little bit of fear that says, oh, well, as I'm going through and building a product, what if people don't like it? We can find out early and often.
Yeah, and that fear isn't just lack of self-doubt. I mean, it's really, it's not just self-doubt. It is actually the existential question of a company. Like,
Right.
Am I doing something people care about? And it is remarkably easy to delude yourself about where that goes. I will say that, while both for Robot Turtles and Glowforge, I came out, happily on the right side of it. In neither case did I know that it was going to be a success. With Glowforge, we did enough market research that we had a pretty good idea that we were going to get to, $500,000 to $1 million, and felt good about that. With Robot Turtles, I thought 50-50, it just wasn't going to fund. Like, I was trying to raise $25K, and I thought there was a good chance nobody would notice and nobody would care. And that actually would have been a much better outcome than the alternative that was available 5 years before, which is to spend a year of your life, go through manufacturing, tens of thousands of dollars to populate your garage with a bunch of cardboard boxes that nobody cared about. That was the world before crowdfunding, and it's a much better world now, where it may be disappointing if what you find doesn't catch on, but you have permission to go back and try again.
Right, absolutely. So another question from the internet at large, was about the idea of kind of best practices and crowdfunding. We've talked about the clarity, the transparency, the early engagement. This question was specifically around offering kind of discounts of your hardware or your software product, let's say. And what are your thoughts and advice for anybody who's considering going the crowdfunding route?
Yeah, it's challenging to be transparent about pricing only because you never know what's in the future. Like, we know what our manufacturer's suggested retail pricing is for Glowforge, which is the amount that we set. So we have a pretty good sense of what we'll wholesale it for, and there's this MSRP, which is, hey, retailer, this is what we think you should sell it for, but then people can do whatever they want. And there have been cases where, I know of one case where a crowdfunding campaign sold it for X, sold it at wholesale for X, and then the retailer discounted it below X. They use it as a loss leader. Now, if Target wants to do a loss leader or Macy's or whatever, that's their right. And in fact, federal law prevents a manufacturer from saying you must sell it at this amount. But for the backers of the campaign, that stinks. Like, going through that process and then coming out on the other side and finding out that people who came later paid less. But it's always really tough to sell. So I'll take Robot Turtles as an example. So I was selling it for, the crowdfunding campaign, it was, I think, $30. And when the crowdfunding campaign was done, I was selling it for $40. And for 6 months, people were selling it for $40. And then then I actually licensed the manufacturing rights to a board game manufacturer, and they got the price down to 25, which is great for the world at large, who now has access to this game for less. I didn't feel terrible about it because I told my backers up front that that might happen, and because they'd had access to it a year before anybody else. And it was a different edition, right? When they started manufacturing bulk, it was somewhat different. But again, it comes back to that transparency, not making promises you can't fulfill. I think you want to try and give the crowdfunding backers the best value you can, but at the same time, the flip side of that mistake is you see companies that sell at such an unrealistically low price, they put themselves out of business. And there have been a lot of cases of that where they just don't raise enough money to fulfill their project, or they don't, or they wind up having to double or triple the price of the product afterwards, after the crowdfunding campaign, which sort of feels good for the backers, but may mean that a project that looked viable at one price isn't viable when you've tripled the price, and so they wind up going out of business because now they have to charge too much. So at the end of the day, all you can do is try and give the best value you can to your backers and be transparent about what might happen next.
Right. No, those are good guiding principles. So now you've done the startup a few times now, right?
Yeah.
And you've also, as you mentioned, worked at Google, you've been at Microsoft, and I imagine there might be some people here that are looking to either make a switch one way or another. What advice do you have them from your experience in industry?
Yeah, I'd say it's been about a little less than half of my working life at a big company, and a little more than half at a small. At first 5 years, I worked at Microsoft as a program manager, and then I went to a startup. Now, I say I went to a startup. I didn't start a startup. Actually, I did. When I was working at Microsoft, I had a great idea for a startup. I thought it was a terrible idea. It crashed and burned. I was depressed and couldn't figure out what to do with myself for 6 months. It was one of the most horrible experiences of my life. And worked at Microsoft for a couple more years, and then went to go work at a friend's startup. And it was amazing because I learned about all my mistakes on somebody else's dime. That was where I got my startup degree. And not just that, but that's where I met people who I've worked with ever since. That's where I met investors who I know who actually had some experience with me, and where I could build a network of people who I could raise funds from. That experience of going to work at a startup was the best training I could have possibly had before starting my own company. And really, that's what I'd recommend to anyone. Now, there's some real culture shock around it and some huge change. Oftentimes, you're taking a pay cut. Depending how early the startup is, that could be anywhere from 30% to 100%. And the environment is very different. There's this realignment where some of the skills that made you very successful at a big company may in fact contribute to your failure at a small company. For example, being able to manage a bureaucracy effectively is a core skill if you're at Google or Microsoft or any large company. And that's not a negative thing. It's that there are these huge agglomerations of people who all have different motives and agendas and directions, managing your career. So regularly helping everybody understand where you're at, what you're doing, what value you're providing. But at a small company, you create value for yourself by making the company valuable, right? The earliest Google employees, it doesn't matter what they did while they were there early. They're perceived to be valuable because they helped make Google valuable in those early days. Same is true of every other successful company at the start. So it has so much more to do with the output of the company than it does with your particular contribution. And that just changes the way you go into work every day. You go into work every day thinking, where are we going and how do we get there, rather than what's expected of me and how do I deliver on that today. And neither one's right nor wrong. Some people love both, but some people have a strong preference towards one or the other. It's much better to figure that out as an employee, where if you change your mind, you can fix that, than as a founder, where if you change your mind, you're abandoning people who are depending on you.
Right, absolutely. And so given all of that experience and now you're starting another company.
Once again.
What have been some of the guiding principles that have come out of your experience? What has backed your company and made it the strong community that it is?
One of the really transformational experiences I had was the second startup I had was a company called SparkBuy. It was comparison shopping for consumer electronics. So it was on the back end that nobody saw and nobody even knew existed. It was hundreds of people in emerging markets who were manually scouring spec sheets, calling manufacturers, and inputting data about every piece of consumer electronics on the market. And then on the front end, it was a really simple and straightforward UI that you could say, I want a big TV that can accommodate my N64 and my PS3 and has an HDMI 60 hertz input or whatever it is. Or I want a fast red Sony laptop. And it could understand those things, translate them into quantitative measures, and bring up the best products first. That company existed for 6 months before it sold to Google, and that's how I wound up at Google. But we had this experience that was just transformational there. We were debating between building first for mobile and building first for the web. And I had this idea that I wanted to try, and it was ultimately why we built first for the web. What I wanted to do was to run usability tests every day on the build of the day. This was the crazy idea. Every day we'd check in code, every night we'd have people use it, and every morning we'd see what happened. And so Scott, my chief architect there, now chief architect again at Glowforge, thought it was a little crazy when I was like, guess what? We're going to have 5 people use that code we just checked in the first time we did it. And but we pushed it out to a staging server. I went to MTurk and I recruited 5 people to go use the software. And the deal was they were going to turn on their microphone, turn on screen capture, upload a video to YouTube of them trying to research a laptop. And so we came in the next morning, we sat down, and it was lunch we decided to do this. So I have this vision in my head of Scott with his burrito in hand, took a bite, I hit play, and he stops chewing with a mouthful of burrito and stares in horror. We had this huge list of bugs. We're like, oh, if you pick these 2 filters, then things will crash, and this filter isn't working properly and everything else. And they were just clicking on something they thought was a button and wasn't a button, and we're getting progressively more frustrated.
There are some people who identify with this feeling in the audience.
Yeah, and we're going like, oh no. And then they're going and there was some other problem where like there was a slider and it didn't look like a slider, and so they're trying to like click the slider and it was a drag slider, and he just quietly set down the burrito and pulled up his laptop, and no lunch was eaten that day. It was so embarrassing. And the worst part was we'd already committed that we were going to push again and run 5 more tests that night. And we felt so horrible watching our users suffer through our incompetence that it did more to motivate the development of that product and motivate the development of the product in the right way. Not when you click these 3 things and move the slider to the right, the server crashes, which to us seems like the worst thing on the planet, but like that looks like a button and it's not a button, so they're stabbing their finger and increasing frustration, right? Server crashes, UI freezes, they're going to be annoyed, they're going to leave and not come back, but they have rightfully left you behind. This was just like torturing our users, and that's what we were doing. And so we had our bug database, and it was full of all the stuff we needed to fix, and we wound up basically completely ignoring all that and developing and fixing bugs entirely based on what we found everyday users were telling us. And that was completely transformational. It was the first time that I'd really moved in the most dramatic way possible from we're going to build everything we can and design everything we can, and we will push and we'll accept bug reports and then we'll look at those and triage them, to like, we're just going to sit here with our ears open and you're going to tell us how stupid we are and we're going to listen. And we're going to try and get better and try and get better. And at some point, we'll be caught up to the point where our product doesn't suck horribly. And then we've earned the right to go innovate and to go try things out and be like, no, we think there's something here that you didn't ask for, but that's going to make your life better. But until we've earned that right, we need to just sit there and listen. And so, Glowforge is challenging because with hardware, you have to do a lot of that up front. But a core part of the Glowforge design was let's make ourselves as responsible as possible, both in terms of how we run the company and in terms of how we architect the platform, allow ourselves to be that responsive to the users that we have.
The flexibility that you get. No, that makes a ton of sense. So let's switch a little bit to kind of the personal fabrication side of it. Now, the audience has heard a lot about ubiquitous computing, signed up for this conference, and they've got a day and a half so far of great talks about ubiquitous computing. You actually place Glowforge more in the realm of personal fabrication, right? So what excites you about what do you mean by that, and what excites you about the potential in this emerging area?
I think there's 2 approaches, and they're both interesting. One is, we have this sensor package, we have cloud storage, what can it do? The other is, we have this old machine that, you know, does one thing and does it well. What could it do if we hooked it up to the wider world? And they both can produce amazing results, and they can both produce comically ridiculous mashups of the internet and hardware. And where you land ultimately is up to customers to tell you about that. This started out very much from the standpoint of, we think that there is something wonderful in the world that isn't accessible to most of the people who would benefit from it. And how can we go use the power of ubiquitous computing, of cloud services, of low-cost sensors to go bring that value to everybody? And you know, this is a very common trend, right? So the 3D printer revolution started, most people don't know, but 3D printers have been around for decades. They were just giant industrial machines that cost $250,000 and were totally inaccessible to the home user. And it was only with the expiration of the first patents around FDM, I think it is, the you know, little tiny hot glue guns that build stuff up like a MakerBot. With the expiration of those patents, that you could actually go build a desktop 3D printer and go drive the price down, and that's what created the first 3D printing revolution. Now, most of the core patents around lasers expired decades ago, because the heyday of laser cutters of development was really around the 80s. But what kept it from getting to people was it was really two things. It was all the support systems required, like the very lowest cost motion planners you can buy. The motion planner takes G-code via USB from your computer, the low-level language describing where it should move, turns it into pulse files, is on the order of $600 wholesale. So, wow, you know, slap that on top of whatever cost you're doing. You're paying already for it. So the cost of these support components was enormous. And ironically, the actual laser parts were reasonably commodified because they're used in enough other things that those weren't so expensive. It was the boards that were created only for laser cutters, which ties right into the second part, which was the market was tiny. And part of the reason the market was tiny was because everybody knew the market was tiny. And it's hard to grow a market when everybody has for decades seen that, as best I can tell, the analysts say there's something on the order of $110 million a year worth of CNC laser cutter engravers under a kilowatt sold. And that's just not big enough to get people excited about investing in that market. So the way to move that to the next level was to say, okay, if we could take technology that was not readily available 5 or 10 years ago and bring that into this product so that we could lower the cost and improve the usability, does that give us access to a market that doesn't exist before? And it was none of those pieces would have worked by themselves. And in fact, had any one of them not been there, the whole principle wouldn't have come together. All those pieces had to be there at the same time. So, you know, this isn't a company that I think could have been realistically started 5 or 10 years ago. But it is the confluence of the low-cost sensors, of the cloud, of the ability to bring meaningful computing resources to bear without having to put them locally on board the machine that made this all possible. And
with the recent advances, you're really creating this market. You're planting the seeds so that it can develop in new and unpredictable ways as well.
Yeah, you know, one of the questions that I get a lot, especially from press and journalists, is, so, you know, who is it who bought this thing? Or, you know, who is your target market? And I always am embarrassed by this, because the honest answer is, before we started, we said, here are a bunch of markets that we know are interested, but we don't know how interested. So there's educators who are buying 3D printers to go use with their kids, and we think this is a more compelling, you know, it's faster and the product is more beautiful. There are engineers who are using these for prototypes and fixturing and that sort of thing, and for, you know, first generation product design. There are scrapbookers who are using tools to go and create beautiful crafts. There are leather workers and woodworkers and Etsy folk and you know, there's all these, and we're like, we know there's interest in all of them, but we don't know the one who's going to get really excited about it and bring us and bring this home. And what we found was, it was kind of all of them. That was the big surprise of the crowdfunding campaign, is there wasn't one group that stepped up and provided the bulk of the orders. It's this incredibly diverse set of users who see this as a tool that would help them do what it was that they wanted to do anyway.
So you touched on something, and I recently went and toured a school and looked at a K through 12 school and looked at their kind of computing lab, and they had, a MakerBot, they had a CNC machine. It was a very nice school. But what do you think, how does this actually change how kids approach to technology? Like, how does this personal fabrication revolution, in a way, change the youth who's growing up to be the next technologist?
So when I was 7, my parents are both professors. My dad was a professor of CS, and my mom's a professor of speech and communications. And they got into an argument about whether or not I should own a computer. And my mom won, so I got the computer. My dad, the CS professor, thought, this doesn't make sense for a kid. So they spent, as best I can tell, it was about $2,500 in today's dollars to buy a Commodore 64 and a disk drive. And when I was 7, I remember sitting on my dad's knee. I'd just seen the musical Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, and stringing together and statements to go make a choose-your-own-adventure type game around the story of the musical that we just seen. Mm-hmm. So fast forward, I have twins, boy and a girl. They're both 7 now, and they came home from school. This is early on in Glowforge's existence. They came home and they said, tomorrow we're having Wild West Day at school. We need sheriff's badges. And so they sat down and they drew their sheriff's badges, and I went over to early version and cut and engraved and this and that, put a magnet on the back, and they wore them to school. And this had been pretty typical of interactions that had been happening for months prior. And my wife turned to me and said, have you noticed the kids are asking us to make things for them more often than buy things for them? And that was the oh my gosh, this is the Commodore 64 that I had when I was a kid. This is a new way the world works, which is there's a revolution 30 years ago that when you thought of an idea, you could realize it yourself in software. Mm-hmm. And now we're reaching another revolution where when you have an idea, you can realize it yourself in hardware. And that's something I can't wait to see what kids who grow up assuming fabrication capabilities, the same way that I grew up assuming computing capabilities, to see what they do with the world.
Absolutely. And on the more, grown-up front, I know I've been having a lot of these conversations where a lot of us who work in technology deal so much with the intangible that we kind of, it's flowery language, but we yearn for the physical, to interact with the world on a tactile level. And Glowforge is part of the way that we can get that back into our lives. It's really exciting.
I spent years building up a wood shop in the basement so that I would have a way to go actually make physical things. And after years of kind of getting the hang of everything, I talked to a friend and he was like, "Oh, I made this cool wallet because I do leather crafting." And I was like, if I want to change materials, that is thousands of dollars and years more, and I wish there was some way that I had a tool that let me work across all these interesting materials. This is years before Glowforge. When the twins were born, I no longer had time to go into the shop, set up everything, set up all the jigs, do some work, vacuum everything up. So I started building RC airplanes and drones and flying stuff like that, because I could go in and tinker for 20 minutes and go out and plus going to the park with babies is fun, and so I'd fly things and they'd kind of stare. And I still had that sort of outlet of physical stuff. The thing that's never existed before in the world, as best I can tell, is a tool that actually lets you realize a creative vision across multiple materials. You can be a furniture maker, you can be a woodworker, you can be a paper crafter, leather, and every one of those has always been a specialty that took years, if not decades, to become proficient at. And so saying, hey, here's one tool that can give you access to all of those. And it's up to you whether you want to draw to use it, because you can draw and have it engraved and carved directly based on your drawings, whether you want to use Adobe Illustrator, Photoshop, GIMP, Inkscape, or whether you're going to use CAD, or whether you're going to create designs parametrically. I mentioned Joe Beta earlier is doing some really cool software-generated parametric designs to go create things that you can then print. However you want to express your creativity, you can bring that to the table and turn it into something beautiful.
Just fantastic. So, but that also leads into, I think, what has to be our final question. It went by so rapidly. What is the favorite thing that you've made with the Glowforge?
Gosh. You know, just because there have been so many crazy stories about it, there's a board, and I've had so many wonderful experiences with, there's a board for the game Settlers of Catan, for those of you familiar. And
Some nods out there.
yeah. So I bought online, because I was a terrible artist, I bought some artwork, and it was, you can go print one of these for yourself for $29. So I bought the artwork, did it, printed a game, had it in the office, Wired came by, took a picture of it, which I hadn't realized. The picture wound up in the article, and I went, oh, that's not cool. Like, we don't really have permission to put that artwork in there, and we definitely don't have permission from Mayfield Games. And then somebody posted to Reddit, and it wound up on the front page of Reddit, just the giant picture of Settlers of Catan, none of the article. And so I immediately started calling everybody I knew, and I was like, got a hold of I think it was Guido Teuber, the son of the creator Klaus. I may have that backwards. And I explained what happened. I said, would it be okay, like, if we, used Settlers of Catan, in these pictures? I'm so sorry this happened. And he said, absolutely not, unless you put water tiles on there. Catan's an island. What do you do? Like, there's no water. And I was like, yes, sir. Right on it, sir. So we brought in this amazing illustrator. She'd actually worked professionally as a program manager and then retired to go illustrate coloring books for grown-ups, which I didn't even realize was a thing, and is an amazing thing. And brought her in for a day, and so we did this cool video where she illustrated by hand with pen on paper this triple-size Settlers of Catan set, scanned those, reduced them, carved and engraved them onto all these exotic hardwoods, and it's awesome because the wood is beautiful. So there's like the finish is just you go at it with some spray shellac and you're done. There's not a big painting and staining and all this, and then turn it into this gorgeous set. And I've had more people ask me if they can buy one. The great thing is when we ship Glowforges, there will be tens of thousands of people who can go print one of those and make it for you. So I have to say it's my favorite.
And I actually saw that on Reddit, and I didn't even make the connection until embarrassingly quite a bit later. So, and it was gorgeous.
Thank you.
So top post. So, thank you so much for coming and talking to us, Dan. And I think that's all she wrote today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really appreciate being here.
Thank you.